That's curtain call. The door is closed. We're going to start. Welcome everyone this evening. It's great to see so many of you here to join us in this special night beyond preservation, embracing change for heritage with our special guest, Caitlin DeSilvey. My name is Christian. I'm a philosopher and an activist working on the intersections of culture, ecology, and climate. So I'm in particular also very interested in what we're discussing tonight. If I hadn't been here, I'd probably have been there for this conversation. I think it's going to be an evening full of ideas about, the role of heritage and conservation in these rapidly changing times that I guess affect us all as persons, but you all also in particular as professionals. And to talk a little bit more from that perspective, from the professional perspective, on behalf of the two hosts of the evening, the Platform for Climate and Heritage, as well as the Board of Government Advisors and the Chief Government Architect, I'd want to invite to kick us off with a further introduction, Jelle Hettema.
Yes. Yes, thank you all. Does this work? Yeah. Thank you all for being here on behalf of the Platform Klimaat en Erfgoed, Climate and Heritage, and the Board of Government Advisors. We have a program today, and I'll give a quick introduction because we have a strict schedule. We want to listen to Caitlin DeSilvey with a lecture and have a panel discussion with our panel members, and afterwards there's drinks. So this evening is organized by two organizations. First, the College van Rijksbouwmeester en Rijksadviseurs. Francesco is the Chief Government Advisor, and this board advises the government on spatial quality, and their agenda over the past 4 years is to look into the future, the far future, 100 years ahead, to see also what we have to do now. And this agenda really fits into today's topic because we want to have a talk about climate change and the impact on heritage, and also maybe the paradigm that we can't keep every monument, every heritage object we want. So the other organization is the Platform Klimaat en Erfgoed, and we didn't have an English logo yet, so I want to maybe make it here, because what is heritage, climate, and, well, we have our board is comprised of 8 people, so it's climate and archaeology, architecture, monuments, intangible heritage, heritage diplomacy, landscape, and also movable collections, otherwise museums. We have, over the past 2 years, we were founded in 2022. Over the past 2 years, we have had 3 events, this is our 4th, and we had some interviews with different heritage experts. We bundled these interviews, and a bit of a spoiler alert, but we have some for you, the panel members, at the end of the evening, but also for the whole room here. So if you want to, please take one with you afterwards. So why this evening tonight? Our first event was in March 2023, and Janne-Marie de Jonge, another advisor of the government, talked about the far future and maybe that we can't preserve everything we want, and she made a comparison to the stages of mourning. So maybe we're now in the denial phase. We don't want to think about it. Some people are already angry. They're standing on the A12 highway protesting, but in the end we have to come to some agreement and some acknowledgement to also make room for something new. This sparked our idea to invite Caitlin DeSilvey to talk about what it means to let go of heritage and how this can be also maybe a good thing. So this is my introduction.
Okay, thank you, Jelle, for giving us a bit of sense of where we are this evening. So immediately we go into the main course of this evening. Caitlin, I'll take a moment to introduce you to the crowd. It's really a pleasure to have you here and to hear more about your, I think, really insightful and also careful work. So Caitlin DeSilvey is a professor of cultural geography at the University of Exeter in England. Her research explores the cultural significance of change and transformation with a particular focus on heritage, ecologies, and climate futures. Her focus on process rather than preservation, has been articulated through collaborative development of a series of novel concepts, including curated decay and adaptive release. In 2017, she published a book called Curated Decay, Heritage Beyond Saving. And she works closely with natural and cultural heritage practitioners and policymakers to translate conceptual innovations, as we'll be discussing tonight, into applied adaptation strategies through advisory roles and active research projects with organizations including the World Monuments Fund, the National Trust, English Heritage Trust, Natural England, and Historical England. So again, Caitlin, we're very thrilled to have you here, and please give her a warm welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you tonight. I'm really delighted, and I feel like I've already started some conversations that I don't want to end, so that's good. I've been invited here to talk to you under the title Beyond Preservation, but I've taken the liberty of putting a question mark on the title just because I think some of what I want to talk to you about will make it pretty clear that there's a conversation that's been begun, but there are a lot of open questions in this space. I'm going to give you a sense in this talk of some of the places that I've worked with in the past, but also places I'm working with actively, including this one. This is Hurst Castle on the south coast of England. It was built by Henry VIII in the 1540s, and there was a partial collapse of a section of a 19th century addition in February 2021. So this is a place that I'm thinking with people about and thinking through. And all of the places I'm going to mention to you are places that I'm actually connected to in some way, which is quite important to me in the practice and the research that I do. But we're going to start by going back in time a bit. In 2017, I published this book, Curated Decay, Heritage Beyond Saving. And the premise was, we speak of vulnerable places and things needing protection, conservation, and preservation. Action is required to restore and maintain their physical integrity. So skip ahead. What happens if we choose not to intervene? Can we uncouple the work of memory from the burden of material stasis? What possibilities emerge when change is embraced rather than resisted? And this was really a speculative sort of opening rather than a prescriptive text that was telling people how to do this. I was asking myself because I didn't know what would happen. And I guess just to lead on to what I want to talk about tonight is that sort of moving on 7 years from the publication of the book, a lot of the questions that I posed in there actually are still unanswered or have generated new ones. But I've also spent a lot of time in the last 7 years working very closely with heritage practitioners, so people who have to manage real places in real time with real politics. And that has meant that, I think I'm trying to be really honest, actually, about how these ideas are moving out in the world. And I'll share that with you. But before I begin, I think it's also important for me to say at this point that my work is about heritage and change. It started with me rooting around in a derelict homestead in Montana. I thought really hard about how to think cultural memory in relation to change, but only recently have I been drawn deeply into conversations about heritage and climate change. And I hope there are resources in my work for thinking through how the heritage sector responds to climate change. But I'm personally a bit wary sometimes of how some of the ideas that I'm developing with other people could get used to sort of naturalize or normalize the kind of change the climate crisis is now forcing us to reckon with, because that was not what I set out to do, and I think I just want to be careful about not making it sort of okay to embrace change in this moment, because obviously there's a huge amount at stake, and I think as I'll suggest as I move on, this is something we have to think really carefully about. So just to begin, I'm going to just use some key terms here. What did I mean by curation? Oh, I've just realized we've had a Mac PC translation font issue. Don't worry about the weird fonts, just ignore them. So curation, right, so we're used to this term, right? We think about it in relation to the conservation and preservation of objects, often in museums. But the origins of this term are in the Latin curare, care, and it was care for human bodies, right? So only later care for objects. And I was asking in the book how we could care without conserving. So how could we acknowledge vulnerability and accept fragility, like this 500-year-old door, feeling fragile, please keep me closed. And I think we can all relate. So something about sort of empathy, just being with the moment, right? When you have something that is just a little bit fragile, but not immediately seeking to restore. So I was asking questions about curation in relation to those ideas, but also about decay, right? So similarly with decay, it's usually framed as almost entirely negative in heritage practice. But I was trying to make the argument that decay is not disappearance, right? So it's, in an ecological sense, it's material being broken down into its constituent elements. It gets disintegrated and then reintegrated into other systems and other forms. Unfortunately, this is a little bit washed out, but what you're looking at here is a little perched grove of elm, sycamore, and buddleia, and there's a little row of leaves in this cornice, but it's growing in the decayed plaster of this roofless mansion in the north of England, and it's actually happy there because those plants are happy there, but also the buddleia itself was introduced as an ornamental to Kew and then was sold and then now is ubiquitous on waste sites all over England. So there's a story there if you can read it. Beyond saving. So this is important, I guess, to recognize that there were two meanings of saving that I was working with. So I intentionally was writing in the book about places that are sort of lost causes, that are beyond saving, deemed too far gone to protect. And you might, for example, this castle in Scotland, Cadzow Castle. But I was also trying to think past the impulse to save and think about when we have the impulse to save, whether there may be other ways of engaging with these places. And this is something that was picked out by the jury of a book prize that was given for the book, where it was just this comment, which I think is really helpful, about how you let things fade away while giving them the respect they deserve and having space to breathe and just pause and be with sites that are in this kind of state. This book is not about advocating that we should let places go where there are resources for saving and where there's a reason to save. It really is places that have already crossed some kind of a threshold, right? So architectural features are becoming ecological and maybe archaeological. Tangible heritage is becoming intangible. Some places have lots of sites like this, some not so many. It sounds like maybe the Netherlands doesn't actually have many places where this has been allowed to run, and I think that's worth maybe talking about afterwards. The UK has quite a few. So this castle is essentially on life support. But when you have a site like this, you can just leave it behind the sort of hurricane fencing and behind the scaffolding, or you can talk about what a good death might look like. And this is something Historic Environment Scotland has started to discuss in relation to sites like this. And they're being very open about it, actually, which is really quite interesting. And this is a site no one's been able to access for many years. Okay, so I was telling stories about these places, and I roamed around and visited many over the period of about 10 years. But I was also writing about places that have been sort of pulled back from the brink or that were held in limbo. I'm not going to tell you about them in detail. You can read the book. But in all of these, it was possible to sort of think askew to usual heritage practice. So in various ways, people were working with, rather than against, processes of erosion and ecological emergence. They were sharing places with non-humans. They were collaborating, perhaps, and coexisting, and sometimes this is done intentionally, sometimes it was sort of incidental. But this is when I confess that the initial response to the book was varied. There was some excitement, but there was also some alarm, right? And I don't know if this term exists in Dutch, but the thin end of the wedge, right? Slippery slope. We can't go there. Like, don't even talk about it, because if you talk about it, that'll give people an excuse to not give us the resources that we need for the places that really need saving. And yes, that is dangerous. And I did mention, there's a question in the book, which is, what are the political implications of providing or appearing to provide a justification for neglect and disinvestment? That's a really big question, and actually, I'm not sure we've answered that question. It doesn't mean it's not worth imagining. So other responses were more sympathetic. A close friend and collaborator, Phil Dyke from the National Trust, said, "Curated decay is likely to be a red rag to a bull for die-hard believers in hold the line, but for me, many of the topics explored simply reflect that the everyday angst and paradox of coastal conservation. and he was working specifically on coasts. We try to impose permanence in landscapes whose very nature and beauty is characterized by dynamism and change. Curated decay perhaps helps build our confidence to think the unthinkable at the edges of our conservation comfort zone. And this idea of the conservation comfort zone is one that I think is probably just worth opening out a little bit. And you know, it's not news. The usual response to decay of structural integrity is based on core conservation principles. The aim is to sustain significance. The assumption is that significance is linked to physical integrity. So when you're faced with a site that's in an advanced state of decay or near collapse, the impulse is to conserve and consolidate. Now, we can accept some degree of what English writer John Piper called pleasing decay, but not so much that it threatens to undermine the stability of the structure and the remaining fabric. So here we're looking at Fountains Abbey. Interestingly enough, I just showed you the fort at the beginning that was started with Henry VIII in its story. This ended, the active history here ended with Henry VIII coming and dissolving this abbey just a few years before he built Hearst Castle. But it's been a ruin for an awfully long time, and now it's very well stabilized. It's this sort of archetypal romantic ruin, and it's well within the comfort zone. But what about a site like this, which is not that far away, actually, and some of you have probably been there, Duisburg Nord Landscape Park. So at this ruined former steelworks, processes of renaturalization are embraced and interpreted, if you can read German. It's not actually. Contaminated soils here provide the ground for the flourishing of neophyte species. So these are plants that arrived in shipments of iron ore. The natural history of the site actually indexes its industrial history, and then its subsequent process of deindustrialization. So for me, the management here is quite ambiguous, but sites like this still remind us that when faced with places that seem to be beyond saving, we have choices. We can demolish, can adaptively reuse, restore, or maybe work with change. Maybe do that for an interval, not forever. Find value and significance in those transformations and emerging ecologies. But I think critically here, see those processes as part of us, right? Part of our stories rather than something to control or contain. And finding those natural histories and cultural histories in the way that they're interwoven in these places. So it's not just about letting go. It's about looking at what those processes are telling us about who we are and how that place came to be the way that it is. It is cultural history. Okay, so moving a bit away from the core argument in the book, although I'm going to stay with the book for a minute because this is the excerpt on the left is from the book. I think, you know, the last 7 years, a lot has happened. I wrote the book actually more like 10 years ago. And I think this, what I called in the book a sort of wider cultural recognition, I think has only intensified in the time since I wrote the book. And I think this is here. I'm just going to read it because I think it's probably worth doing in the context of what we're talking about tonight. So a cultural recognition that we need to find ways to inhabit change rather than deny or deflect it, and to find meaning in transition, transience, and uncertainty. If one accepts that we live in a world of ecological unraveling and rising seas, fragile economies, and gathering storm clouds, then one is forced to admit that we may not be in control anymore, if we ever were. When Ernst Kallenbach, the author of the 1975 novel Ecotopia, died in 2012, he left behind a document on his computer that included this prescient observation. Humans tend to try to manage things, land, structures, even rivers. We spend enormous amounts of time and energy and treasure in imposing our will on nature, or on pre-existing or inherited structures, dreaming of permanent solutions, monuments to our ambitions and dreams. But in periods of slack, decline, or collapse, our abilities no longer suffice for all this management. We have to let things go. All things go somewhere. They evolve, with or without us, into new forms. So as the decades pass, we should try not to always futilely fight these transformations. We can embrace this process of devolution, embellish it when strength avails, and learn to love it. So there was a rallying cry. I think that was published a while back, and I've become aware of an alignment also with the ideas that Jem Bendel's been developing about deep adaptation as a response to the climate crisis and needing to learn how to relinquish intentionally rather than retreat reactively. But I've also become much more aware of the need for a heritage ethics, which is aligned with work towards climate justice, right? So recognizing radical inequality in the way that change, climate and otherwise, is experienced, and the privilege of having choices. So as a little bit of a provocation, if people in relatively stable parts of the world that historically benefited most from the production of wealth that fueled the climate crisis can hold some things more lightly, could we divert resources to parts of the world where cultural loss is acute and not incremental, and support people to practice self-determination in their response to change and carry forward what they can and record what they can't? So rather than just, battening down the hatches and holding on to what we have. And I think that there's an ethical imperative, and that will only become more intense as we move forward. So what resources do we need to navigate this moment? And this is when I sort of do a little policy wonk swerve. So there's like a mini paper inside this paper, but you're going to have to bear with me for a few minutes while I flesh out some new ideas that I've been working on. Because I spent 2 deep COVID years hanging out with heritage sector colleagues and natural environment colleagues and some academic colleagues. And we were trying to figure out how we take some of this thinking and we move it into practice. And this doesn't look like a very good beginning, but we went back into ecological theory. And we started looking at some of the ideas of an ecologist named Buzz Holling, who was developing ideas about adaptive cycles in the 1980s. And so he was coming up with ideas based on observing ecosystem, which showed that you have an ecosystem that has a front loop of renewal and conservation, and then what he called the back loop, when because of firestorm, pests, or just senescence, you get destruction, which then leads on to a phase of renewal. And so this thinking has become incredibly influential in resilience thinking, and it's moved into ideas about socio-ecological systems. But this idea of release seemed really productive to us when we started to look at this. And again, I was working with people in historic England and natural England who are both the regulators for the historic and the natural environment. And I have to admit, sometimes I think about that time as like a fever dream. Like we were in that weird COVID online space and anything was possible and nobody was doing their day job. And so we came up with a wild idea and we put it out there and we said, okay, well, if release can be productive, why don't we invent something called adaptive release? So, and this was specifically for a historic environment context. So can we come up with something that reflects an active decision to accommodate and interpret the dynamic transformation of a heritage asset and its associated values and significance? So not fixed significance, gone if the thing changes, but that's going to emerge. So the term adaptive was about this iterative reflective management. That idea of adaptive management has been around for a long time. But you also monitor and learn from change. And we were really careful to say the approach isn't passive. It requires this engagement over time and some commitment to sort of sticking with those uncertain outcomes and those messy change trajectories, as we called it. So immediately it makes it a head scratcher because you're like, well, hang on, if you're letting go of something because you can't afford to protect it, then why would you invest money in hanging out with it while it's being let go? And where's that money going to come from? And the insurance company's not going to pay for that. Anyway, a whole bundle of stuff that we talked about. But for me, it's essentially the ideas in curated decay, but taken into a framework that you could like put in one of those decision matrices, whatever. And I was recently picked up Gertrude Stein's Geographical History of America, where she says, what you say makes you want to say it another way. And I was like, oh, that's what we were doing, basically. So this is where this stuff goes into policy. And it's drifting out there. It's creating a whole little cloud of, oh, yeah, we need this idea. So here's adaptive release. There's all the stuff at the top that you really should do if you can, right? But if you can't and you've had to say the word loss, then maybe what you need to do is actually say a different word and say, okay, release. And so moving into that space, you do continue to monitor, you do continue to think about those natural cultural histories, and you do provide opportunities for people to engage. And so you've got the Forestry Commission now talking about it in relation to their tree work. You've got it appearing in the National Trust for Scotland's visioning that this is into guidance, International National Trust Organization. And then you've got it appearing for the Hearst Castle site. And then marine climate change impacts. Nobody's actually doing it though, right? So this is when I confess that like, it looks really impressive, but actually we have zero active case studies at the moment because it's really, really difficult. And breaking out of that conservation comfort zone is not something that you do rashly. You know, these organizations were designed, their remit is to protect. So what's happening right now is a lot of work behind the scenes to try and come up with, you know, decision frameworks, talking about adaptive pathways, talking about co-benefits. It's gone into the sort of ecosystem services language of like, well, if we're losing that one, can we get this other benefit? I'm not that keen on that, but it has to happen in order for it to become embedded in particular government decision-making policy context. I get that. And the way that they tend to talk about it is often, well, we're going to make a virtue of a necessity. We're going to have to move into this space, so we're going to lean into it. And so this is a very active space at the moment in the work that I'm doing in the UK. But it's also appearing in EU guidance. So here, this was Council of Europe guidance, just in case you want some ammunition. So this was a project that actually a colleague of mine was involved in, where there is this acknowledgement that we need to work productively with rather than against inevitable change, sometimes, not always, just sometimes, and be aware of those values that arise from connections and interdependencies between species, objects, places, and practices. So I'm now going to talk about a real place where I've been drawn into conversations about its future. And this is very bottom-up. This is not top-down. This is the people who live there actually engaging with these ideas. But I think a real place starts to expose both the promise and some of the pitfalls. You know, so here we are. This is the English countryside. We're just north of the city of Exeter in the southwest, a town called Wellington. And this town was built around a complex of mills and works associated with 2 centuries of textile production. So what we're looking at here, this massive building in the forefront and then that one over in the distance with the tower, were both associated with the Fox family. So the Fox family founded these in the mid-18th century. They were Quakers. They were committed to workers' welfare. But by the 1990s, the core business wasn't really sustainable anymore, so things wound up. And they've been decaying by default ever since, both these structures. So this one here was where they did most of the dyeing and the washing. So the river actually ran through the building. You can see it there. And then the one in the distance was where they did most of the weaving and the spinning. These are both grade 2 listed on the National Heritage List for England. They're both on the Heritage at Risk Register. These are problem sites. But they are places where these ideas about curated decay and adaptive release have taken hold in really interesting ways. I should mention at this point as well, though, that there are places with a very dark history, which has never been mentioned by any of the people who talked to me about this place, and it was something I found out on my own. Fox Brothers was one of the main textile suppliers for the British Army for close to a century. It produced the classic scarlet serge uniforms, and then introduced the khaki dye that was used for the uniforms in the Boer War and the puttees that were wrapped around the legs of those First World War troops. So another version of the history of the site is talking about how it's deeply interwoven with the violent history of empire and colonialism. This is a problematic heritage. How that sits in relation to some of these ideas that are emerging there is something that's still open. So here we have a First World War soldier dressed in Fox textiles. Okay, so what's happening here? At the Tone Works site, the watery one, the council has been working with a local architectural firm called Thread, and they've devised a plan for partial reuse and partial curated decay. And I've been brought in as a consultant to explore options with them. So the plan that they're talking about there is very much a sort of compromise. So they might leave things like this self-seeded vegetation. This is a cherry tree, which becomes a sort of part of a wild winter garden. But the architects there are also very honest about the limits to the approach that they're trying to adopt. And they have to make changes to ensure the safety of visitors. They can't let the roof fall on people's heads. There was asbestos in the building. So all these discussions about, you know, okay, we're curating decay, but how much decay and who decides? But there is a sense that they will find a bit of a delicate balance. And so there's just amazing, there is an amazing heritage in this site, industrial heritage, and there's things like these teasel plants that are actually set within the carding machine because the teasel was better for carding the wool with than the then the metal, it didn't tear the wool fibers as much. Okay, so there's something that you can go to the Threads website and you can see them talking about what they're trying to do there, which is quite interesting. But then the sister site, which is the old mill complex, is a site where there's actually potential for more radical experimentation. So there's a 50 million pound conservation deficit on this site to bring it back into use. And lots of failed development proposals have like flown and died. And I was actually approached by Ben Fox, who's a descendant of the family that owned the mill. And he said, help me think about the future of this place. I've been reading about this adaptive release idea, and I'm interested. What can we do? And I was like, well, okay, we can talk about it. What have you got? And so we started to look at what he was working with here. And it's a massive site. But what's fascinating about this is that you have this interest from the bottom up, from people like Ben, in trying to manage that decay. But then you have other people who aren't sure it's crossed the threshold yet. And I think that's where the concept of the threshold becomes really key, because who decides? There's a wider context here, which makes it a really interesting test site for adaptive release, in that the adjacent field, which used to be workers' recreation area, has actually been taken over by the local transition group, which is a sort of climate activism resilience group. And so they're now saying, well, we're going to manage this historic part of the estate. And if you do release of the mill buildings, this is the sort of artist schematic of this, then we can have this integrated, connected landscape where we actually have new communities emerging, human communities and plant and animal communities. And I think that's when it starts to get really interesting, is this idea of actually having people intentionally choose to do this kind of management in a place for very clear reasons. I'm slightly running out of time, so I'm going to whiz through this last bit here. And I think the point here in relation to climate is that, we're expanding the Overton window. It's becoming possible to, thinking the unthinkable makes the radical imaginable, maybe. But it takes a huge amount of work, and you are starting to get places like the Government of Ireland talking about managing loss, guidance that actually accepts that they might need to document and preserve by record before allowing sites to go. If I can have an extra 2 minutes, I will do my final site. Are you going to allow me that, Chris? Okay, because I sort of hope somebody in the room knows this place. So we're going to do a big swerve. This summer, I visited friends in the village of Fanghetto on the French-Italian border in the Maritime Alps. And it's a perched village. You can see it here in the middle. It was semi-abandoned after the Second World War, but it was partially reclaimed in the 60s and 70s, mostly by Dutch holidaymakers who bought up little properties. And what's fascinating about this place is it sort of sits on this border between dwelling and decay. It's sort of like partly inhabited and partly still slightly undercut by ruination. So I was really interested in, I think, what was suggested by these sort of partial and provisional solutions in a place like this. But just to bring it back to climate, because that's what we're talking about today, this particular valley that Fanghetto is set in also has quite a dramatic history in relation to the climate crisis. And so a storm in 2020 swept through the valley, the Roya Valley, and it completely devastated places like the upstream French town of Bray-sur-Roya. This was the town hall, the Mairie, which was inundated with debris. But what's interesting here is that people did not let go, right? They did not walk away. They rebuilt. And so they now have a manifesto on their website about how they were strengthened by the storm. And these photographs are by a French photographer, Jean-Pierre Ray, who really documented that spirit of rebuilding and reclaiming. There were elements of things that were lost. So this was a Roman bridge just below the village of Fanghetto that was completely washed away. And it's just memorialized by its footings. And then, second to last slide, here just downstream from the lost Roman bridge, the people who lived in Fanghetto went along the banks of their swimming hole, and they gathered up the splintered wood and the metal debris and created this little shade shelter that you can see there in the center. So really a sort of responding to destruction with creative improvisation. And, again, this is not letting go, but what it is it's a radical revision of the way we think about caring for place as something which is bottom-up and democratic. This little sign we found 4 miles downstream and 4 years later after the storm. And I will now end because I'm getting looks. But I think the point here is that we have options, right? So we tend to, have this sense that what we're supposed to do with heritage is to appreciate, to contemplate, to be concerned. But post-preservation suggests that we can actually be much more active, create, cultivate, improvise, renew. And just there are other resources out there, just to flag some of the reading. Something funny's happened there, but I think just to end, I think I want to be really clear that, yes, embracing change can happen, but I think partially what we're going to need to learn is how to let change embrace us, and really flip it and recognize that we have a responsibility to try to think more creatively in this crisis moment that we're in. So thank you very much.
Caitlin, thanks so much. What I love about your work and your thinking is that it's both quite provocative, but it's also very nuanced and very, very place-based. So I can only imagine the audience has a couple of questions for you. We have a minute or 10, so we can take a few questions. There's some mics to go around, I believe. There's mics on the chairs to go around. Would anybody, don't be shy, would anybody like to ask a question to Caitlin? Over here.
Yes, thank you so much for the very clear story. I guess in the Netherlands, you are, if you are an owner of heritage, you are obliged to repair and restore and keep it in a certain state. So my question is, what is the legal issue in here?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's not, the context is not that much different in the UK. So one of the things that's been fascinating about the work that we've been doing has been trying to find the edges in legislation and policy and figure out to what extent this would be allowed. And what we've discovered is that actually neglect, you can sort of get away with, if you're an owner of a heritage site. But, you might get someone coming in with a conservation order or saying you need to repair that like for like. Or, but if, but so that is sort of, you can maneuver in that space, but intentionally saying, I am going to now allow this site to deteriorate, and I have a good reason, and I'm going to make a case for that, still near impossible. So we've been, it's not that the UK has quite figured out how to navigate that little sort of gap yet. And, but it is, I guess what is happening is that it's being actively discussed. And there is, I'm doing one project with Natural England at the moment where there's sort of like a sort of policy-free overlay where we're experimenting with what policy would need to look like to accommodate these approaches. And so the discussion is live, but the legislation is still pretty clear that it's not permissible if you're going to do it intentionally. If you did it covertly, you probably could just about manage it. But then that's not the point. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. I was wondering, how do the people who live in this village with textile industries, how do they feel about the neglect and the plans for these buildings?
Yeah, so this one, I think what's happened here is that the community is exhausted. I think there have been so many different development proposals for this one particularly, and now there's an overseas owner who doesn't have any local connections at all, who bought it as an investment and is sitting on it but can't do anything with it. So I think there would have been a point maybe 10 or 15 years ago where this kind of option would not have been acceptable to the community, but things have changed, and now that they have that active group managing, if you can imagine, the field that you can see right behind the building to the left is actually the field that now has a forest garden in it that's being managed by the local community. And so, and they're doing wildlife surveys, and they're trying to figure out what's happening ecologically in this space. And so they're very open to this idea now of it transitioning into a space where there might be sort of partial decay and partial reoccupation and almost gardening in that space, and having it be continuous with the work they're doing in the field. But I think that's probably quite specific, that if you come in with that idea fresh, when people's memories of that being a working site were quite live, that would have been very difficult. But I think it's maybe a lesson about living with the pause for a little while. If you have a really problematic site, that there may be an opportunity in not rushing to a solution. I think, there are probably people who thought that should have been demolished years ago, but now they are where they are. So I think it's going to be very dependent on what contexts are. Yeah, sorry, we're...
Who do I go to? Is there a question there? Yeah, also just behind. Sorry. Thank you so much. So your work is mostly on built and natural environments. Do you also feel that ideas you've developed here are applicable to material objects or other types of heritage? When you think of museum storages that are, completely filling up and things like that?
So I guess for me it's a question about scale. so I actually started working with these ideas on my PhD research, where I did a sort of contemporary archaeology material culture study of decaying artifacts in a homestead in Montana. And so I actually scaled up to be doing this work, and have struggled a little bit, because actually the work that I was doing with the artifacts that I was working with, which were things like, decaying invoices and shopping lists from 50 years ago, or junk drawers full of balls of string and things like that. There was something really quite productive about working in those spaces with those objects where it's quite low stakes. And since I wrote the book, I've then been drawn back to that scale, because I've been invited to talk to lots of people who manage museum collections, and I've done a collaboration with the Copenhagen Medical Museum. And it's interesting to me how, again, context matters. So when you're doing that kind of experimentation in a place like the place I did my PhD research, where nobody was looking over my shoulder, it was possible to really, curate that decay and work with it. But when you start to work in museum spaces, it can seem, we did do it at the Copenhagen Medical Museum, but it felt very contained. It was the room in the basement, and it was also, there was an element of when does it end, right? So there was a sort of odd contrivance about it, which is like, we're doing this now. And then when they realized that they couldn't do it anymore, they were like, what do we do with all the things that we've been letting decay? Because decay runs, right? And there's something about how you commit to these processes. I have been working a little bit with people who talk about creative disposal in museum contexts and what that looks like, and how you might release things out for other uses, which might be decay or, public use. And I'm meeting with folks here in this building tomorrow to talk about these ideas. So I think there is a curiosity about bringing these ideas into those spaces, but again, I'm not sure where we're at yet with the sort of practical experimentation. But we did write a couple things about the Copenhagen work, if people are curious.
We have time for one or two more questions, I think. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for an amazing lecture. But I wanted to ask, is there an explanation of why there is an evident discrepancy between natural, or let's say older heritage, and industrial heritage? Why does industrial heritage always fall into the letting go aspect? Why is it easier to let go of industrial heritage, even though by all means it looks much more sustainable since it's younger, so to speak, than older heritage? Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is partly about sort of, if we have heritage objects that were from deeper in the past, they've like set, I think for me it's maybe about the threshold question, like if they've settled in a state that is now being conserved, usually sometimes a state of conservation or restoration, and sometimes a state of arrested decay, then opening that can of worms up again is probably not something people want to do necessarily. Whereas if you have a question mark over a site, which is often the case with industrial heritage sites, and you don't know which direction it's going to go, and you have all of these different proposals on the table, it's possible to add this one to the mix. So I don't know. It'd be interesting to jump forward in time and look back and see how we're thinking about these sites. But it is true that they're easier to think with in relation to this, often because they are sites where these live ecological processes are running. This wild growth, plant growth and animal growth is fun to think with, whereas that's not the case at other sites. And I think this is where, again, going back to that point, I'm not talking about doing this in places where they are maintaining or, taking a site where there is an active use and proposing that this should be done, or sites in the middle of urban context where they really could be redeveloped and turned into housing. And I think I've had a lot of questions at me over the years about that kind of thing. And I think it may be that these threshold sites are actually relatively uncommon as well. Yeah.
think we had one last question all the way up there.
I saw one here.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Two questions, maybe. One question and one remark regarding your question on the collections. I'm from the support organization here in the south of Holland for heritage, and we developed a experimental way of dealing with a collection by the Sleeping Beauty scenario, which means that we will let the collection of a certain museum in our environment in Vlaardingen sleep for at least one generation and let it for the next generation to reopen it and see what they find of importance, and also let it decay in a certain way. And it will be a complete experiment. Wow. I can explain more about it. It's not really useful doing it here. But my question for you is also, what we experience with maybe decaying is that there's also stories to tell about. How do you evolve that into your research, or maybe not at all?
Oh, I do. I mean, and I think that for me, that's the part of my research that I enjoy the most, is being really precise about what are the decay processes, what are the plants that are growing there, why are those plants growing there, what fungus is growing there, why is that growing there, what's happening chemically, like what stories can we, what can we learn about the construction of that building by how it's decaying, what is it revealing as layers are stripped off and we can see the inner architecture. And this comes back to some of that ecological thinking. I'm trying to write a paper at the moment going back to Stuart Brand's ideas, how buildings learn, because he was actually reading Buzz Halling, who's an ecologist, and talking about fast and slow parts of a building as well as fast and slow parts of an ecosystem. So this gets a bit nerdy and technical, but I think there is an interplay between ecology and conservation and heritage conservation, that there's a prehistory there that we don't talk about very often, but I think I hang out with a lot of ecologists and I go to them with pictures and I say, tell me what this plant is, and then I go learn about the plant. And I think that being able to be precise about what the ecological history and the natural history emerging from that site is really important in this, but that takes a skill set that I don't necessarily have it, I only have people around me who can help. So I think, yeah, that is really critical. But and then trying to write that in a way which is legible to people and not just overwhelming is, yeah.
Great. Well, I guess we all look forward to that next paper of yours, Caitlin. I guess we'll step into the next phase of our conversation together. Feel free to pick a seat and a color mic if you like, Caitlin.
Wow.
And then I'll also invite our other panelists onto the stage before I introduce you all. Maartje, Francesco, Tom, please join us and please welcome them onto the stage for us. Sorry? No, I guess that would be way too well behaved. It's I think this is great. So happy to have all of you here. I think we have a really diverse set of perspectives here around the campfire, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation that for sure will be too short, but I hope is also stimulating for all of our audience here. Let me start by introducing you all to the crowd. Here in the middle we have Francesco Veenstra, who is a chief government architect and as such chairman of the board of government advisors since September 2021. He monitors and promotes the architectural and urban quality of government projects and advises the Ministry of the Interior and the Director General of the Central Government Real Estate Agency, also known as the Rijksbouwmeester for the Dutchies in the room. Francesco has been a partner also at Vakwerk Architecten in Delft since 2017. So again, Francesco, great to have you here this evening. Next to you is Maartje van Bennekom. She's a heritage professional at the Erfgoedvereniging Bond Heemschut. And that's an association for volunteers that work to prevent the degradation and/or demolition of heritage and monuments in the Netherlands. She has a background in European studies, public history and philosophy. And prior to her work at the Bond Heemschut, she focused primarily on contested histories, such as colonialism, through a podcast and other projects under the rubric of Far Too Close. So, Maartje, also great to have you here this evening. Last but not least, to my side, Tom Tieman is a documentary filmmaker, film director and journalist working in the north of the Netherlands, in Groningen. He works on climate change, heritage, the changing landscape as well as the countryside in his work. And with Peer Group, he made a site-specific theater play called Huilende Bruiden, otherwise known as Weeping Brides, about decayed farmhouses in the east of Groningen. Farm manors?
Manor farms.
Manor farms. And in 2024, he turned this into a documentary film, or sort of a documentary film, I guess, with the same name that premiered at the Dutch Film Festival. So that's us here. What I want to do is raise a couple of topics for you, introduce them a little, and then throw the ball to one of you to give a bit more elaborate response, and then see where others want to chime in or add in, or maybe even contrast and have a little debate. And I'd like to start with you, Tom. And as a filmmaker, I guess only talking about what you do would be slightly boring, and it would be fun to also have a look at what you do. And I guess just to introduce a little bit of film that we'll take a look at in 1 second for the director's booth, or the laptop. I don't know where we're going to project it from. I think what we see from Caitlin's research is that this site specificity is super important, right? When we talk about heritage, the value of heritage is always embedded in local histories and cultures. And the work which you have been doing with the Huilende Bruiden also brings in all these different dimensions through the character of the building, even, of the heritage object as an agent and an actor. And I want to ask you a little bit more about that, but I'll save my question for after the clip. Let's have a little look.
Er gaat in Groningen een verhaal over ons rond. Dat we ooit zo rijk en imposant waren. Dat onze zuilen versierd waren met klassieke vrouwenbeelden. Maar tijden veranderen. En door weer en wind liet het pleisterwerk van de gezichten los. Huilende bruiden worden we genoemd.
Right. Great. So a very moody start to the movie, very atmospheric. I guess it also brings us into the Dutch context, right? From Caitlin's international examples. And Tom, you know, you've told me that you've worked in this area also for a long time. You live in the area. You're working around these topics of decay, climate change, complex topics. You're bringing them into this movie. So I wonder if you could just open up our conversation by talking a bit about how you see these topics as a maker reflected in these farmsteads, and how they're part of their surrounding.
I think Caitlin kind of took the words out of my mouth with your lecture, which was very interesting. So these manor farms have been there for like 160 years. They're part of a very problematic history with the farmers who built them around 1860, 1870. They were called the Champagne years. They were so rich, so they made these huge farms, and now they're some of them are in decay, not all of them, but how I look at them was your question?
Well, I understand. You told me that you're interested in the decay.
Yeah.
You're thinking and you're working a lot around climate change, and these are not per se, let's say, colloquial topics, stuff you just talk about with the local inhabitants.
No, that's kind of difficult. Yeah.
So I'm wondering how you bring those topics into this situation, how you look at these, let's say, complex situations in Groningen with this long history, with the social inequalities that come along with that, and then what you see in terms of decay alongside these local communities, talking to them, having theater plays where you run dialogues with them.
Well, I see something that's very rare in the Netherlands, which is decay, a building that's in decay. Because normally we demolish a building that's in decay and then restructure the whole ground and build something else on it.
Yeah.
And now there was something unique, like a ruin. I grew up next to a forest, and there was always a ruin of an old, also a manor house, and only the basement was left. And for me as a child, that was like heaven to play in. You know, there were all these rocks were there, and it was probably not safe, but for me it was very alive. And then later I came around, I think around I was 30, I think. I came back, and it was all pinned down. It was closed up, and there was this fence around it, and I thought, this is ridiculous.
The Dutch are famously organized.
Yeah, we're famously organized. So I thought this is also going to happen with these old manor farms, and wouldn't it be interesting to just let them decay in full sight for everyone?
Because you see a beauty in that.
I think it's beautiful. And I think it's also very honest about us.
Yeah.
We also will decay one day and die, like these buildings.
Yeah.
But if I say it around there, then everyone is like, "What are you talking about?" And
did you find any allies in your perspective?
Not much.
Okay.
No. I found one. Just
okay.
Yeah. No, but it's a very problematic topic there.
Yeah. Because it ties into different kinds of like histories of neglect, I think.
It ties in like a history of a region that already feels neglected, and also because there's problems with earthquakes and the ground that's sinking slowly. There's economic an economic backlash there. So yeah, if you start around, why did we get site specific? Well, it's funny that you have this picture, because this is also one of these old buildings that has been demolished after this picture, like a year. And I thought this also tells a part of a different story, which is because you have the farmers and you have the laborers. And the laborers used to live in these old, well, now the picture is gone, but live in these old, very small houses. And demolishing these houses would also mean that you're erasing part of that history.
Yeah. So, Maartje, we're going to get back to the question of working with volunteers a bit later, but just to kind of follow up on this, let's say, appreciation of decay, do you see anywhere in your work some starting appreciation of these kinds of processes, or is it still very avant-garde stuff we're talking about?
You know, you already mentioned that we like to, if something is in decay, we like to demolish it and then build something new. So I think in that sense, for my volunteers, decay is maybe preferable to that scenario. But we do try to fight decay very often and try to get an owner to actually bring it back in good state. But I already saw some of the pictures that we provided from a site in Zeeland, in the south. And was funny, I needed pictures of that place for an article I was writing about how terrible it is. And I needed some striking picture that brings about some emotion. And that's when I got into contact with some people who are really into urbexing. So going to abandoned, decaying places. And they really see the beauty of these places, maybe in some haunted way. It's this picture, actually. There are videos on YouTube of people staying a night over in this place because it's maybe haunted, or they really romanticize this place, so they maybe bring about a new appreciation for the heritage in a way that maybe we at Heemschut don't really have. Yeah.
Thanks. So just to move from let's say the aesthetic and maybe the underdog appreciation of decay, also to the more practical side of the matter, and looking also slowly towards you, Francesco, from the work of Caitlin, the way you're narrating this, going from conservation, maybe to curation, maybe even to stewardship, to these kind of blurring the lines between the different kinds of practices a conservation professional might engage in with these buildings. and we're throwing climate change into the mix on top of that this evening, and it gives me a sense of whether we are facing somehow a paradigm shift, both in the fact that we're dealing with more uncertainties and disruptions, but also with the question of whether these different kinds of appreciation can emerge, right? And we all know about the classical notion of conservation. We have to keep everything basically ad infinitum for an unspecified amount of time. I think that's also the way the law states the obligation of conservation. But maybe now we are also looking towards a situation where you have to think about triage, where we have to think about different also modalities of dealing with the question of what to keep and how to keep it. So I'm wondering, Francesco, do you also see, you're looking also far ahead as Rijksbouwmeester into the future. Are we witnessing something of a paradigm shift in conservation practice? And how do you think, also more generally, like how do you think policy should respond to both these questions of decay and also disruption and uncertainty? What are your thoughts on that?
That's yeah. Well, we of course pre-discussed this session, but actually, usually I'm pretty sort of confident in being in this position, just reflecting on what I've heard from a speech or a keynote. But actually, on the topic of heritage, I always feel a bit uncomfortable, and the reason is that I experience sort of shifting thoughts myself about how to relate to heritage as a discipline, or how to relate to a building as an object. And in the previous conversation we had, I mentioned the word triage as a way of making certain decisions between keeping, on the one hand, an object that has a certain meaning for people, for a community, and another object, another building that is in decay and can be lost as part of a collection. Where we are where we find ourselves in a situation, I think, from the early 20th century, that preservation and developing this collection is moving to a point where it might not be possible anymore to retain everything and to I find it difficult to find the right words in English now, but
preserve, I guess.
Well, not only to preserve, but to let the collection grow to a point where it's almost impossible to reach the next point. And I think that could be a very dangerous point to move ahead. So if we want to preserve all the buildings that have a certain meaning or a certain quality, then we might reach a point where we lose everything. And I think in that sense, your story about decay or letting go to a certain point without losing the value of it, where the meaning still exists, but maybe in a different way than the physical way, I think is a very sort of open-minded but maybe necessary approach to another type of preserve that we haven't been thinking over the past maybe even century.
Yeah. So perhaps a paradigm shift.
Well, I find it also difficult to bring climate change into this discussion. So is there really sort of a connection between preservation or dealing with heritage and climate change? I mean, climate change is there. Heritage is there. Buildings that will not last for the next 10 years is still there and will change. And so is that really sort of a fundamental aspect now to bring into this discussion in order to find answers that are necessary to find in the context of the growing collection, not only of buildings, but someone mentioned also the collection of art and the growing collection of art. Do we have to make well, I think we have to make decisions there.
Well, I guess one could argue, you know, that from my perspective, that sort of the climate change kind of disrupts our sense of the future, right? Because where the future used to be something we had a level of control over, we could kind of predict also that society would continue on the path it was going down, and now increasingly the future has become very blurry, and on the optimistic side it might be kind of fine or no worse than we are experiencing now. On the pessimistic side, you know, we might have to let go of an incredible part of the Netherlands in the coming 100 or couple of centuries. So maybe Caitlin, maybe you can kind of help us out here, because you've been moving from the more maybe speculative, as you put it, propositions in your first book, now into maybe a bit more policy, hands-on case studies. But you said, like, this is work in progress. We aren't yet at the level of active pilot sites or cases running. But do you have an intuition, an inclination, or maybe even just concrete tips, like? Are there already tools emerging, or principles, or ways to kind of engage with these questions from a practical level in situ?
Yeah, that's a tall order, but I don't have any sort of guidebook, right? So and this stuff has to get worked out in specific places. I think one of the things that I'm feeling really aware of, and I have talked about this with a few people tonight, is that this is not going to be linear, right? So the idea that you're going to be able to sort of map it out and be like, oh yeah, you're going to go there, and then that path is going to lead there. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, one of the most interesting nonlinear and unpredictable elements of this is how people are going to respond when the things that they love are threatened. Mm-hmm. And I've started to wonder whether the skill that we need to develop, or, you know, as I guess if there's a we of sort of professionals and people who have ideas about this stuff, is to actually let go control of the top-down management. And, you know, and so in the UK, you know, this expectation that you have to do a like-for-like repair on a heritage building, so if you get a storm like the ones that are already hitting Cornwall coming through, and someone's living in a listed building and an end collapses, and they could just go and take some breeze blocks and put it back together again and still live in that building, but they've got to get listed building consent so that they can repair that building. Wow. And so we actually have had discussions in Cornwall, because I'm advising in our county, so we have a county governance. And we have a change working group that just does heritage stuff. And we actually had a fascinating discussion recently where, it was put on the table, like, is actually the whole system of designation a little bit broken? Like, do we need to just loosen it up so that if people want to move into that space and repair or create something slightly new or just keep things ticking, and they have the passion and the resource to do that, can we just get out of the way? And I think that's a completely different debate to have. And it's not about decay necessarily, but there's so many examples coming up about places where there is, the perception of loss, and then people are coming in and saying, like, no, we'll repair that harbor now, thank you very much. We'll put that bridge back. In the Sycamore Gap, I don't know if you guys followed the iconic tree, right? So suddenly there were people coming in, like, planting their own trees in that spot. And I think that's the fascinating, there's a nonlinear path which actually has more engagement rather than less. So
I promised the audience we didn't prepare this, but this is my next question about audience engagement, because you're giving me a beautiful introduction. I think the image of the tree being cut down, I guess we remember it in this valley in the UK, beautiful, and then it was gone, and this provokes an engagement, right? People start to stand up for things they love once they fear they will leave us or be lost. And so, if we move a little bit away from the conservation, letting go binary, and it's maybe more of a continuum of care somehow, Maartje, you're working with all these people who are volunteers, who are very engaged emotionally and otherwise. And I guess we are also living in an age where participation is moving a bit more to co-creation. We're opening up a bit more to participative processes from a policy perspective. So do you see this changing role for communities in the now, in how heritage communities are becoming engaged with heritage, and could you kind of like give us an opinion or a take on where you think it should be going? Are there different ways governments should be kind of stimulating these heritage communities? Should there be a larger role, or are we kind of like in a good place in the Netherlands with the way we have public participation?
That are, I think, 3 questions maybe.
You can pick whatever you like out of that and respond, yeah.
No, so what I do notice, maybe to start with, I think you also mentioned this in your book, that decay often is a sort of a first motivator. Sometimes for people who've actually never thought about heritage before. So we have this sort of a hotline for heritage at risk at our website, or we get phone calls from people somewhere in the country saying, well, there's this building in my village and it's at risk, it's decaying. And they suddenly sort of awaken to heritage and think, oh, this is actually valuable and I care about this and I want to pour my energy into this. And then we, we move in, we help them with the sort of to go and talk with local politics and try to preserve something. But it's most of the time very hard. And I think it's very hard because local politics are difficult and you end up in a sort of bureaucratic landscape and the people, they care about this building and they want to act from this notion of care, but then they end up in a very dry landscape of rules and laws and they don't know what to do with it and they don't know where heritage is actually located in these local laws. So they need a lot of help with that. Yeah. And sometimes I think that could be a lot easier when we talk participation. I think local governments try to do a lot of participation, but they sometimes forget about just making it easier.
They're so used to their own structures that they might not see the labyrinth.
And it's difficult to get out of your own structure, I guess. Yeah. And we try to advocate that if in a local community you want to change something, have a look at the heritage that's there and work with it and take it as a base for your change, as a guide for change, instead of sort of seeing buildings as disposable and wipe it out, start anew. I think that's sort of shows a lack of creativity often.
There's of course also the huge commercial pressures that you face, which are of a whole different order than climate change.
Yeah, I think that's usually what we fight instead of climate change.
So Caitlin was kind of indicating a sort of a wiggle room that would ideally be there. Maybe not certain principles or practices, but if there's a bit more space for experimentation, for people taking a certain level of control of the meaning and the development of a building. Is that happening at all in the Netherlands? Are there these kind of sites where there's a bit more space, or is the legal framework, I'm not myself a heritage professional, I admit, do you see that there's any, or people are sort of taking a bit of extra space to give more meaning and take more agency over the trajectory of heritage?
I've only been in the heritage sector for 1 year now, so I'm really a young heritage professional, so I cannot say that much about the trajectories over time and how it's changing, but I have seen places where communities have really taken things into their own hands and develop their own visions for the future and how they want it to be, and they put that to paper and they present it to their local government, and really, special things can definitely happen, and we try to also use those as an example for other places and take them as a guide how things maybe can be done. Yeah.
So the storytelling element there, Tom. Coincidentally, you are a storyteller. Do you feel that the way you've been dealing with these topics, that this narrative element, is that the stories you've told, the theater plays, maybe the films, have created different perceptions with people in Groningen, have created different dynamics? How important is that storytelling part with this heritage?
I think it's very important because we're now in Rotterdam, so we're in the west. Not a lot of people know these buildings in the east of Groningen. It all started with a writer who wrote a book about it, De Graanrepubliek. It's a really good book, by the way. Tells you the whole history. So I kind of took it from there, from that book, and went into the countryside and spoke with the locals. And so I think telling the story is very important, but the whole perspective of letting it decay is not so popular. So I'm trying to slowly get it into the minds of people, but maybe I also feel, well, not really responsible or anything, but I do feel like I'm the one who should throw the stone in the water, in the pond. So,
okay, great. Maybe so for a last topic to introduce. it's not the elephant in the room, but it's like at least a creature in the room is the ecological side, right? So kind of the other side to a lot of this decay seems to be that through the mortar and the bricks that we're used to dealing with, the vines and the plants and the greenery starts to creep in. And of course, that's kind of an aesthetic issue. It has a different look and feel. People engage with it in a different way. But what I really appreciate, Caitlin, about your work is that you're also really not just talking about plants, but also really talking about a more embodied, maybe, sense of presence. There's a very different quality to the type of engagement you're describing. It's not such a cold and objective gaze, perhaps. But moreover, that there seems to also be a different conception of time in there. And maybe this is a bit nerdy and philosophical, but I was still very curious how you think about this, what you also have called eco-culture, how that influences our sense of time, our sense of being present in processes, and what we maybe can take from that in our storytelling and in our approaches to these different ways of thinking about our heritage.
Yeah. Which part of that question?
I think I'm fascinated by this idea that you have a different sense of time when you're in these spaces that are decaying. It's very different from the monument that's frozen in a certain moment, right? This is a process-based. It's dynamic. You maybe feel also more in your body, I would say. So I'm curious. You've been working along this. How you think about that, or maybe an experience you've had with that really has resonated.
Well, I think Tom used the word honest in relation to it, because what's amazing is that those places that have been abandoned, what you're seeing is a living clock, right? So from the moment when they stopped being actively used and occupied, if they haven't been conserved, if they haven't been maintained over time, then you actually get this amazing index of time passing. And some of the things I talk about in the book are, places where the impulse to then go in and do the right thing, sort of like, and particularly one ghost town in Montana where they were like, oh no, it's been abandoned for 50 years, and it had all these little trees that were growing up that were exactly 50 years old, and then they decided that they needed to do terrestrial laser scanning of the whole thing, so they went and cut down all the little trees because they destroyed the line of sight to the little shacks that they were trying to survey, and it was just this sense of loss of like, don't you see what you have there? Like, and I think for me, it's like just wanting to, again, maybe that feeling isn't universal, that when you're embedded in a place like that and you can feel that time elapse, there's something really magical about it. And I think, sometimes with the work that I do, like, I really got the bug when I went to this homestead site in Montana that had been semi-abandoned for about 40 years, but partially occupied. And I went up there after it had been totally abandoned for a couple of years, and I was just absolutely gripped by the state that it was in and the stories that I could sort of peer through the windows and start to detect. But it was also quite a private experience, and it wasn't something that I necessarily felt the impulse to share. And then in the end, for that particular place, as I found out more about it and the story accumulated around it, and this relates to some of the stuff we've talked about actually, the story created then a set of, created a structure for value to rush in, and suddenly everyone cared about it, and then suddenly we had to save it, so like that place that started my thinking actually contains all these paradoxes in it, in that it's now, we saved it because the story insisted that we save it, and now 30 years later it's a living history site up in the hills where you can go and see it. And they actually took elements of the material that I'd assembled when I was doing all my research, and they made a sign that says curated decay, and it's sitting in one of the old sheds. And they've just left everything the way I left it, which is great, I guess, but there's this sort of sense of it. It's really difficult to do this stuff in a way that doesn't feel like you're then just containing it in a different way, I guess. And that feeling that you get when you're encountering a place like this and you feel like you're discovering it is actually incredibly, that's the really electric moment. But that's one where, how do we let multiple people have that feeling in relation to these processes? And that I don't know. The urbex folks, I suppose, get closest. They can pretend that they're the first person to go into those places, and they never are. But there is something about recognizing that we are incredibly attracted to that kind of both aesthetic and the ecological element of like other things own this place. It's not owned by us, I think.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Well, I think there's quite a strong example of such a situation in the field of modern art. And there's this place called Verbeke Foundation in close to Antwerp, and this is where they have the collection outside the areas of sort of old sheds, well, also inside the old sheds, and where nature can basically conquer the artwork, and where you see the decay happening, and where also nature, well, almost becomes part of art in a way. I think it becomes a different typology in heritage at one point. So will we allow it to become a new typology, or is it just a different state in which a building or an object finds itself?
Do you think there could be sort of this farmstead that Caitlin is describing? Do you think there could be also a value for the architectural practice in kind of recognizing and experiencing this very different sense of what a building is as compared to like a brand new structure, to put it on two extremes?
I think, yeah, to me that is sort of the difficult part. Architecture is also there to serve a certain meaning in use of the space. So if space is not in use anymore by people, so what is then sort of the purpose? Will we be able to allow it to have a total different purpose than only the purpose of serving people? To me, that's sort of the question.
A post-human question. Wow. Almost running out of time. I want to still do a round of final thoughts, what everybody would maybe still like to add. And I'll kind of just go first, and you can take it as a question or just come with your own point. But when I got invited here, what I found really, really fascinating is this, and it's a very obvious idea, but the heritage obviously is a prism for us to look both into our past and into the future, and bringing decay into that conversation as well as climate change, that makes it for a very complicated and heady mix. But working in culture and being very concerned about climate crisis, I've always been feeling that that's also such an opportunity to open up spaces of fragility and conversation through these kinds of objects. So it's kind of a basic sense of hope that I have for heritage to also be with us through these difficult times, and be for us also something of a translating device or a time machine to understand the times we live in. And maybe that's something you also want to reflect on or add something else. We still have a few minutes of time on this broader cultural significance of heritage in this precarious moment that we're living through. Or did I just do a closing statement?
I guess I can go first.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned that I'm quite new in the sector, and I'm also quite young myself, so I worry a lot about the future. I think like a lot of people in their 20s do. And what really baffled me when I came to Heemschut is how disposable we actually think buildings are. I knew we think clothes are disposable or plastic or whatever, but I didn't think actual whole structures and buildings are cast away that easily. So I really hope that heritage and this new conversation about reuse that climate change brings about invites more creativity to work with what you have, because I think just destroying something, it's really not that creative. So I'm actually quite angry about that. And idealistically, I just hope in moving forward that we can heritage can we're moving into times that are going to be very unpredictable and very unsure, and a lot's going to change probably for a lot of people. And I really hope that heritage can offer something stable to people, that I have some buildings to look at that I know my grandfather has also seen, that maybe that's a place that we can come together to feel something that is stable in our lives and throughout generations. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll just say one. I mean, I think I hope that I can be hopeful, but I think one of the things I just feel really, even just looking at the kind of destruction that's happened over the last month, right, in Nepal and North Carolina and Florida, like we're going to have to be really kind and kind of courageous to respond to that and still value what we call heritage in the same way. And we're going to have to be honest about the fact that some of the things that we're preserving as heritage are absolutely implicated in the processes that delivered us to the point that we're at right now. And I don't think that we can sustain heritage and ignore that point anymore, actually. So I think the word heritage is a tricky one when you have people, you know, losing their homes in places that thought they were climate refuges.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I guess that's redefining the terms. I think is probably going to be important.
Yeah. As the Dutch say, like het wal keert de schip. So either we'll try to be adaptive ourselves, or we'll be forced to change our ways by the climate, right? Yeah. I thought you make a move, Tom.
Oh, not really, but I was just thinking of my two characters in the film, because there are two manor farms who are speaking, so I gave them a voice. You're gonna see if you see it on TV, and they have inhabitants, and the two inhabitants have a very different approach of accepting that their building is gonna collapse, and perhaps they are gonna collapse as well. And the one who looks the most insane has the most sane approach to, you know, her mortality and accepting that it is what it is. So I just had to think of that.
Great. Well, I guess we'll look forward to watching your film. Thank you. That's really interesting. Francesco, the last word is yours.
What I find most interesting about beyond preservation and connecting it to climate change is that do we reach a point where the economic value of property or a certain place will become sort of repositioned, not in the first place, but maybe nature should come first. And to give you two examples, I once saw a movie about Chernobyl, where people left, of course, that place over 30 years ago, and where nature took over, and relative new species for that area started to find their way and to grow. Not a similar place, but in the Netherlands, and we studied that area quite intensively in the area close to Den Bosch is Fort Crèvecoeur. It's the same kind of place where nature took over. It's like a half-abandoned place of the Dutch army. And you could question whether or not that place still should be taken as highly economic value, and that we should redevelop it. For instance, as a distribution center area, or maybe to have hundreds of houses being located close to the river and to the highway. But instead, we are in a situation to give it away or to give it back to nature. I think if we would find more areas to let go and to let nature take over, maybe then we will find ourselves in a situation where the value or the idea about value starts to change and also starts to influence our thoughts about the entire economic system as a whole. So that could maybe be sort of the major take from the thinking process you have brought to Rotterdam today. And something that we have to process and bring, well, together with my colleagues, back to the Dutch central government and to rethink. It's a big thought, but to rethink the economic system.
Amazing. Okay. I think it. So from adaptive release to a new economic paradigm, I think we're done for the night. I want to thank you all so much for contributing, Tom, Francesco, Maartje, and of course our special guest Caitlin for coming over to illuminate us. Give them a big hand, please. So tonight we're like Oprah's book club. Everybody gets a book, not only the special guests. And I think before we all head out to our drinks, I think I can announce some extra events. I guess this is it, right? Just to point out to you all that that the platform Climate and Heritage also hosts more events, and you can always follow what's up on the website. Thank you to all dear audience for joining us for this evening, and I hope to see you all outside for some drinks. Thanks.
The film is on NPO 2 on the 18th of November at 23:20. Look it back on NPO Start. Yeah. Okay.
18th of November. Thanks for the question.